Hi everyone, this is Nia and today I'm going to be painting a simple pear branch. This is a very easy painting and I decided to paint this in a vintage sort of style, so I'll be including a lot of warm and muted colors. Let's start the sketch. I'm starting with the main branch, which I've placed diagonally across my page, and it's slightly higher so there's space for the pear to be at the center of the page. I've chosen this diagonal composition because it's going to be quite a simple composition without too much on the page, and the diagonal line will create more of a dynamic feel. Again, because there won't be too many elements going into this composition, I find that it helps playing with the angle, so for the pears, instead of placing them flatly on the page, I decided to depict a lower viewpoint where the bottom of the pears are slightly exposed. You can include 2 to 3 pears depending on the size of paper as well as your own composition. I tried adding one more, but I just felt like it was too full considering my sketchbook is fairly small. Once I'm done adding the 2 pears, I added smaller branches growing out of the main branch. Then I add leaves growing out of those smaller branches. I tried to make larger leaves as well as smaller ones, playing around with the angle as well as folds. And I also made the side of the leaves slightly textured. This is to bring a bit more interest since the painting itself is quite simple. And this is basically it for the composition. You can always adjust the amount of leaves and branches according to the size of your paper. But next, let me go over the colors that I'll be using. Indigo by Schmincke, Terre Verte by Holbein, Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith, Vermilion by Holbein, Jaune Brilliant Dark by Schmincke, Sepia by Holbein, and Bleedproof White by Dr. P.H. Martins. Now let's begin to paint. I am going to start with the background and I'm using my large brush here so I can cover a larger amount of space in a short period of time. And as for the color, I'm using Jaune Brilliant Dark with Sepia as the main color, and I added a bit of vermilion to warm the color slightly. I'm using a very thin consistency. You can see how watery this is, and I'm going to try my best to cover the background while avoiding painting on the main subject that I drew out. And as I get towards the bottom, I also want to make the colors even lighter, so there's a slight gradient from darker at the top going to a lighter tone at the bottom. Sometimes I like to dot in more of the same color in slightly thicker consistency for the top part after I've painted more towards the bottom. This gives me a better idea of the relationship between those two values, and personally I just find it so much easier to add on more pigment than to take off with watercolors. I've almost reached the bottom here, and as you can see, the bottom paint is very watery. It just looks like tinted water at this point. With this said, I found that there weren't enough contrast from the top to the bottom, so I'm going to add a little bit more pigment, and I also realized that it'll look better if the background is slightly textured, so I'm making sure when I'm applying more paint, I'm doing this unevenly. Once I'm done, I'm just going to dry everything off with a hairdryer to make the process much quicker so we can paint the rest of the elements. Once the background is completely dry, I'm going to move on to paint the pear. For the color, I'm making a light yellow-green from a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium and Terre Verte, and I want the pear to have slight orangey tone. So for the orange, I used a mix of Hansa Yellow Medium with Vermilion and a little bit of Jaune Brilliant Dark. I ended up mixing those two color mixtures together and using a really light tone to paint the base color. It's very light, but if you didn't notice here, I also left out a little bit of negative space along the sides for the highlights later on, and the white space will just create a barrier so the paint doesn't run into that area. While the surface is still damp, I'm adding a little bit more of the green mixture. As you can see, this is the reason why I didn't mix everything completely together on my palette. And I'm going to also pick up some of the orange and just dot it in random places for the pears. I'm going to do the same with the second one. I'm using a slightly thicker consistency this time, so it's a bit easier for you guys to see. Then I pick up a little bit of the green. You can also add more Terre Verde or add more Vermilion depending on what you have on your palette. Here I decided to take more Vermilion so the color is more vibrant. This will serve as the base colors, and as you can see, I'm working mostly on a damp surface, so the colors should just mingle with each other. But if some areas of the surface is drying up and the edges of the color is looking too sharp, you can always soften the blend using a clean damp brush. After the base color of the pear is dry, I'm going to layer on more paint. At this point, I wasn't sure how vibrant I want the pears to be, so I'm working in a fairly light consistency. Hopefully you guys can also see the negative space now. And I'm going to again use the green mixtures as well as the orange mixtures and just dotting them randomly around the pear itself. Personally, I like the bottom to be slightly green and the top to be a bit more orange. I like to give the accent colors around the edges, so you can see that the color is a bit more vibrant on the sides as well as the bottom. And I also try to use a slightly darker value or a thicker consistency to show the roundness of the pear. Once I'm done with the second pear and the first pear is completely dry, I'm going to add a darker value. This time I'm adding vermilion to the previous mix, and I also added a little bit of sepia to mute the vermilion and also darken the value. And I'm going to place this around the sides, especially around the curved areas, so I can accentuate the form. As I'm getting closer to the highlighted area, you can see that I'm using this dotting motion to create an uneven surface and a slightly textured skin for the pears. I forgot to mention this earlier, but you might have noticed between the orange and the green for the skin of the pear, I like to use this yellowish tone as a transition between those two colors so they don't blend into a muddy mess. This is because I used a little bit of yellow for both of those color mixtures, so the yellow helps to create the softer transition. I'm going back to the first pear again because now it's completely dry, and I'm going to paint the bottom of the pear. For this I used a mix of sepia and vermilion in a thick to medium consistency. For this one, I'm imagining sort of like an eye shape, and then I soften the bottom part using a clean damp brush. Then once it's dry, I'm going to go over the middle section again using a thick consistency of sepia. And I'm going to do the same for the second pear as well. Here I'm adding another layer for the texture of the skin. This time I'm just using the same colors as I've previously mixed before, with the muted yellow, the green, as well as the vermilion. And this time you can see that I'm creating more of that textured dotted brush strokes on a dry surface this time, so those textures are a little bit more pronounced. I want to slowly increase the vibrancy little by little, so I'm adding more of the main hues like vermilion as well as Terre Verde. Then to clean out the edges, I added more Hansa yellow to the vermilion and sepia mix, and I'm using a thick consistency to give an outline to the pears, especially in areas which has unclear edges. You can of course mix this to more vermilion or even more Terre Verde depending on the area of your pears. I personally like to use more of this yellow tone for the parts of the pear that I'm outlining. And you can also use the same color to add more textures as well. This is completely up to you. Since we've been layering little by little, it just depends on the stage of your painting. Next, I'm going to create a warm dark brown by using a mix of Terre Verde, sepia, and vermilion to give more vibrancy and warmth to this brown. I'm using a medium to thick consistency to apply the base color of the branch, starting with the main branch where I applied a bit more pressure because I want the lines to be thicker than the smaller branches. While I'm applying the color for the branch, I'm also wiggling my brush slightly to create uneven edges. This way, the sides of the branch doesn't look completely smooth, instead it looks a bit more rustic and natural. Where some of the branches turn to create a slight corner, I like to add an extra length to those corners as if there's going to be new growth in that section. Next, I'm going to create a greenish brown. With this color, I'm using a thick consistency to create the younger branches, which connects to the leaves as well as the pears. Since these lines are fairly thick, it helps to switch to a smaller brush if you find the size brush to be a little bit difficult to control. Or you can also use a dry brush load to make it much easier to control the flow of your paint going out of your bristles. And this also keeps the bristles more pointy since it's not too heavy with water or paint. After this, I'm going to create the colors for the leaves to have it accessible on my palette. For this, I'm using a mix of Indigo and Terre Verte, placing this at the bottom. And I also want to add this mixture to the brown for an earthy dark green. For the light green, or the base color of the leaves, I added Jaune Brilliant Dark to the previous color of the stem. When I'm applying the paint, I want to use a light load on my brush. This way those areas dry pretty quickly and they don't become too puddling wet. Since the composition is quite simple, I'm going to work with what we've got and just make the most of it. So I'm going to add interest to the leaves by adding some textures. I like to paint a few leaves at a time to wait for the previous leaf to dry. This is why I use a light load. Then I use the same color in a slightly thicker consistency to add some values and textures following the folds of the midribs and veins of the leaves. With this said though, you can also add any of the greens that we've pre-mixed for a slightly darker value. For instance, for this one, I added the mixture of Terre Verte and Indigo, and for the end of the leaf, I also used the darkest green. This is quite randomized, so you'll see me adding textures, but to some others, it might be a bit more simple. Generally, I like to add more detail and texture to the largest leaves and also leave out some small white space here and there so larger areas doesn't look too dense. I personally like to pre-mix my greens so the tonalities are consistent with each other and the colors are easily available since there are lots of leaves to paint. I still have a lot of leaves to paint, but I am running out of the greens that I'm going to use on my palette, so I'm just going to refresh them by adding and mixing more colors. And after this, I'm just going to keep painting them on in a couple of batches at a time. This way I can wait for the specific amount of dryness when I want to add the darker values, so the edges are not too sharp but also not too watery and puddly at the same time that the colors that I add will run too much into each other. Whenever the leaves are big enough, I will always try to paint following the direction of the curvature of the leaves or the growth of the veins. This way, whenever I leave out some white negative space, it will also help with the enhancement of the form. I'm just going to keep painting the rest of the leaves here and get back to you once I'm ready to move on to the next step. For overlapping leaves like this one, it helps to use the dark green to paint in between those two leaves and separate the shapes, but still following the form of the midrib and the veins of the leaves. Once I'm done painting the leaves that I drew out, I felt like there were too much space in between the leaves, so I decided to add more freehand, especially ones which will overlap or painted under some existing elements. This will just help add depth to the composition. I'm still going to add details to these leaves, but I'm trying to keep them a bit more simple compared to the ones that we've previously painted. I started out by painting large ones to fit into the composition, then I tried to fill in the rest with smaller leaves so it looks like there are different stages of growth. After this, I'm going to add more leaves. This time I'm using a warmer green which has a bit of yellow and a bit of vermilion from the base color of the pear. And this time I'm going to paint them flatly without additional texture. I'm also using a light consistency so it looks like it's positioned further back in the composition, which adds to the depth. After the previous ones are completely dry, I like to use a similar color that you can vary depending on what I have pre-mixed on my palette to add an additional layer of leaves, still painted using the same loose and flat method. Once the leaves are painted, I feel like the pears are losing a bit of interest, so I'm going to add more definition and detail to add contrast against the leaves. Here I'm using a mix of vermilion and sepia in a thick consistency to add some dark outlines. Then I used a clean damp brush to soften the blend while using the dotting motion, so as I'm blending, it also creates additional textures. I'm also going to use some of the lighter yellow-green as well in a thick consistency for those additional details. After that, I'm going to add more background color to make the space look slightly more dense, as I feel like there's too much space in random places that it looks a bit too cluttered for my liking, so I'm going to use this background color to gather some of the elements together. Lastly, I'm going to use bleed-proof white in a medium consistency to define some of the highlights, as well as add some finer ones. I don't want to use a thick consistency, so the white is slightly transparent and less glaring. Bleed-proof white is generally opaque, so for some areas which are a bit too opaque for my liking, I'll treat it like watercolors and soften the blend or take off the excess using a clean damp brush. For the second pair, I decided to add some extra texture using bleed-proof white. I'm just adding some dots in a light consistency. And finally, I'm just going to make some final adjustments, adding the darker values here and there to increase some contrast. And that's basically it for this painting. I hope you guys enjoyed this simple composition. If you find this tutorial useful, please consider subscribing to get notified of new tutorials which I upload every Friday. Like usual, the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in the description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!